also orients the capitalist towards mechanisms that increase its rate of surplus extraction or the rate of exploitation. This is the profit motive. It's very clear to us in this economic crisis that people are concerned about profits. Now, the only way that you can extract more surplus value, Marx theorized, was by a downward pressure on wages, extending working hours, these are all familiar to people, lower rates of pay, or through technological mechanisms. And this is a very, I think, radical element to Marx because technology poses an interesting additional bonus in capitalistic production because it disciplines the workforce. So the worker has to work to the machine, as Marx says, and they are disciplined by time, speed, and location, the factory system itself. Competition is also an essential drive here because the capitalists must produce a more productive rate than other capitalists. You have to be at the top, you're always having to innovate. Now here becomes the real catch that Marx identified. When you use technology to increase worker productivity, it creates a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. This is highly debatable among economists. It continues to be a source of debate. This is where Rosa Luxemburg is actually going to part company with Marx, and she says actually technology can increase the rate of profit. That is an empirical question that we will need to address because it has a very close link to value production. But what Marx says is that the rate of profit will fall, not that there are no profits, but the rate will fall, and that this is a long-term tendency. The result is, as profitability decreases, you have an investment demand decrease, people hoard money, there's deflationary pressures, liquidity and the circulation becomes a problem, and lo and behold, you have a crisis in capitalism. There's empirical work that would show very clearly we have been in a long-term decline in the rate of profit, which has only slightly rebounded in the last 5 or 6 years. So Marx may be proven quite right here. But for him it's important because that crisis is not the end of capitalism, it is the opportunity to destroy inefficient capital and to realize new production relations, still based on the extraction of surplus value, but to restore profitability. This is his theory in a very quick and brief way. Now, Luxemburg understood, I would say, most of this. Again, there's a debate, and she wanted to sit down and look at capitalism in her moment. And the most defining feature for Rosa Luxemburg was this drive for imperialism, what she saw as growing violence. She writes her most significant economic work in 1913. So she doesn't know about World War II yet, but all the signs and portents are in place, and she wants to understand how capital is going to accumulate under these conditions. And here's where she wants to part company with Marx because she doesn't necessarily agree that production occurs for the sake of production itself. So let's just take a moment to think about the context of Luxemburg at this point. She is a Polish Jew who studies economics, achieves a PhD before the turn of the 20th century. Phenomenal woman. She organizes workers in Germany and Poland. She participates in the first round of revolutionary uprisings in Russia in 1905, and she begins to theorize that the mass party is not the way to revolution, but the masses themselves through strikes and organized activity. This puts her on the outs, actually, with the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and she takes on most of the leaders at the time, including our friends Lenin and Trotsky on many occasions, because she also did not support movements for national self-determination, an interesting side that I would love to discuss. But in this context, in 1913, she sits down to try to address the question of imperialism. She's not alone. The left at the time is doing similar things. Capitalism has actually gone through a series of crises. It's in 1815 and the 1830s, which are recessionary. And the question of accumulation is not so assured anymore. Production for production's sake doesn't seem to make sense. liberal economists who suggested that the system would always return to this wonderful equilibrium and social welfare would just keep increasing, and we realized this wonderful dawn had to admit that that wasn't occurring any longer. And what she does is she sits down and says, how does accumulation really happen? Well, you have to go to volume 2 for Marx to look at his economic diagrams. And she says, here is a problem. Because Marx sees production for the sake of production. But if profit doesn't fall, there is no way for capital to continue to accumulate. So where does it go? For whom is surplus value extracted, she asks. And she says, well, there's only one place capitalism can go. Looking at history, looking at geography, she says the place are non-capitalist lands, and you must sell surplus value to non-capitalist places, which happens to be, in our terms, the global south today, or the third world for, it's even ahead of that for Rosa Luxemburg. Now, there are a series of problems of first suggesting that these places are outside of capitalism, and I could draw a critique. But this is really where Rosa Luxemburg is at her most powerful and theoretically, I would say, the most brilliant, is when she starts to understand how it is, whether or not surplus value is sold to these places, but how it is that capitalism pursues its universalizing impulse. And in the final sections of The Accumulation of Capital, she writes in beautiful and descriptive language powerfully about how capitalism arrives on the global scene dripping with blood head to toe. It is violent. It has to pursue the forcible destruction of natural economies in places. Peasants must be driven from the land, and the expropriation of resources and human labor are absolutely necessary to encourage accumulation. Now, Luxemburg believed that once these places become enmeshed in global capitalism, we'll be right back to the same problem of what to do with surplus value. That there will be no longer an ability for capitalism to continue to accumulate, because the logical limit that she sees, whereas you can't sell to yourself forever, would be back in play. And that is where she sees the breakdown of capitalism. There's one other chapter in The Accumulation that is significant, where Luxemburg actually attempts to analyze the role of militarism. There's one other little safety valve for capitalism that she sees. Marxists are often ambivalent about what to do with the state. Does it constitute a market? Does it participate in accumulation? We see the state is absolutely fundamental in ensuring liquidity and credit circulation right now. But Luxemburg says the one place it does furnish a market where it can drive accumulation is in the purchase of military hardware, in the redistribution of taxation to armed forces. Now, when Joan Robinson wrote the introduction in 1951 for The Accumulation of Capital, she said clearly Section 3 was the most overstated of Rosa Luxemburg's, and probably the part we could do away with the most quickly. In 2008, it looks like the most prescient part of Luxemburg's analysis. She redirects our attention away from the core of capitalism, which we all want to focus on. I mean, CNN tells us the United States is the core right now. That's the crisis. And instead, Luxemburg says we have to look outside of those places. So discussions like the effect of the crisis on the African continent, or how regulation occurs outside of the core, was fundamental in her mind for understanding what types of alternatives exist, and we need to be attentive to what those core states are doing with military budgets. Now, she didn't know about Halliburton or Lockheed Martin. She didn't know about Blackwater or Sandline International or Executive Outcomes. She didn't know that paramilitary corporations would be huge international business. But she saw an interesting safety valve, which means we could start to very radically take her critique and say the crisis is not 2008. The crisis has been building since the 1970s as capital has incurred a number of accumulation crises. It's attempted to resolve those through some neoliberal restructuring, but its most fundamental attempt